So in the previous two videos, we tackled what methods were and how to actually put them to use in your program code. So it's now time to talk about method overloading. Now, method overloading is very commonly used in Java programming and actually in other programming languages. And it's the option where you use the same method name, but with different parameters. So as an example, we're going to type in some code to show you what this looks like and how you go about it. So let's start by creating a method. I'm going to call this method calculateScore, and we're going to type it as public static int calculateScore. And we're going to have two parameters here. The first one is going to be player name, that's a string. And the second parameter is going to be score, which is an integer. So I'm going to type SOUT and press tab to print the system out, and I'm going to type in player plus player name scored plus score plus points. And then what we're going to do is return score multiplied by 1000, which is an arbitrary number which we're not going to use anymore. We've just done that so that we can return something, and that's because we've defined the method to return an integer. So just to confirm that that runs, we can actually type the name of the method as you've seen before, calculateScore. I can pass a parameter of a string in double quotes for my name, and let's just put a number. We'll say 500 points. And if we run this, we should find that we get it to work. We see over here, player Tim scored 500 points. And if we wanted to, we could take the value that's returned, because that's what return does. It actually returns whatever the amount is back to, in this case up here on line 6. We could change that if we wanted to put new score equals calculateScore, because you can see that on line 12 we've multiplied score by 1000, and we can print that out as well. But new score is plus new score. We run that just to confirm it works. New score is 500,000, which of course is 500, which we passed, times 1000 is 500,000. So that's how you use a value that you've calculated in a method and return it. And from the process that actually called the method, you can then use that value for some sort of calculations if you want to. So nothing particularly unique there. We've seen that similarly set up and used in the past. Okay, so let's go about overloading the method. Now, I may have said overriding earlier in the video, but just to be clear, this is overloading methods. So overriding has got a completely different meaning, and we'll be talking about overriding later in the course, but this is overloading methods, which is basically using the same method name, but with a variable number, different number of parameters. So we're going to start off by creating a second one, and actually what I'll do is I'll copy it, copy the method, and I'll paste it. Now notice when I do that, first of all we get an error, and it says calculateScore, and note the string comma int on screen is already defined. So that's Java telling you, look, you can't use an identical method with an identical number of parameters. There's a problem there. So options to fix this, well, the first option would be to put an S there to make it a different method name, and of course that will work, but that's then a separate method. We're not actually overloading the method, we're creating a new method. So in this case we don't want to do that. So the way we do it is we change the number of parameters. So I can get rid of the first parameter and make it so that this method now has only got one parameter, which is the score. And notice that the overall error went away, that we've got an error here now on line 17 because we're trying to access a variable with a parameter that no longer exists in this particular method. So I'm going to put unnamed player, and actually what we'll do is we'll put scored 500 points. Now notice there's two methods there now, and the error, well, not an error, it's a warning on the screen now because it's grayed out, the method name compared to the one on line 11 is saying that that's never been used before. So that's just IntelliJ saying, look, by the way, you've created this overloaded method called calculateScore, but you're not using that particular one. You're only using this first one, which is in the brighter color, and you can see that we're using that on line 6. So we can still run that, and we still get the same results we got prior to overloading the method. But to actually use this second method, what we need to do is we need to type it. Now notice when I started typing, IntelliJ now shows us that we've got two methods here, and we can select which one we want. So if I select this top one with the single parameter, press enter there, Noting that there's two options on the screen now. IntelliJ is sort of saying, well, there's two ways that you can access these methods. You can either use the first one, in which case I need a player name and a score, or I can use the second one, in which case I only need a score. So I'm going to use the second one and just say type in a value like 75. And you can see that that's valid. And that's now going to call that second method if we run it. So let's run it to make sure that does work. Unnamed player scored 75 points, which is clearly the code from the second method. Now Java is checking, so we can't actually do something like calculate score. I'm going to put 100, 100. We'll actually get an error there. And the error that's coming up saying is it's the wrong first argument. Found int required a string. So what IntelliJ is saying there is, well, okay, if you want to call this overloaded method with two parameters, I know that you've calculated and set up one on line 13, but that needs to be a string. So that's what it's complaining about. And if we added a third parameter, then it just sort of says altogether, well, hang on a minute, you haven't actually created an overloaded method with three parameters of int. Now notice that it's actually saying int, comma int, comma int. And the point to all that is that what makes it unique is the data type in the parameters. So it's not what you've typed in for the parameter name. That can be literally anything you want. That's no problems. The thing you need to keep to get the same to, or what Java uses to determine whether it's unique or not, is the data type. In this case, the string and the int. Okay, so let's do one more. Let's try and create a method now that's got no parameters. That's a third one, and at the moment that's going to come up and say can't resolve method. And that's just as in the case as if you made a typo creating a new method. This is now saying, well, hang on, you haven't got a method with that name. So let's now try and create another overloaded method with no parameters. The way we would do that is we get rid of the parameters and then we put a player name, no player score. And we can't return anything, so let's just return 0. Can't return anything because we can't calculate anything because we haven't got a score to work with. Now notice that that's now valid and we can actually run that. So we run that now. You can see we've got all three methods working on there and they've all got separate output, and you can see that output working quite nicely on the screen. So what we're trying to do here, when we're overloading a method, we need to create a unique method signature. So the signature is essentially here is the unique part is the actual method name. You can see that's the same in all three cases here, but it's also then the parameters. Now you might think that you could change something here. You could say, well, okay, let's create another method, calculate score. I'm going to copy that and paste that, but let's make it a different return type, or make it maybe a void instead of an int. So to return a void instead of actually, and I'll get rid of that, because there's no return now because it's a void. So you might think you can do that by changing the return type. Does that make it unique? But the error we're going to get here says calculate score is already defined. And what Java is telling you is that just changing the data type of the return type, the type of data that's going to be returned from the method, doesn't change the overall signature. So you do need to change the number of parameters there to make it unique. So I'll just delete that line again. Okay, so that's essentially how overloading of methods work. So what I'm going to do now is issue with a challenge to get you to do some overloading of your own. So I'm just going to paste in what the challenge is, and then I'm going to get you to go away and have a go at doing it, and then ultimately I'll actually do it on screen for you as well. So let's paste that in up here. So here's what needs to be done. So we need to create a method called calc feet and inches to centimeters, and that needs to accept two parameters. First parameter is feet, and the second one is inches. It's the second parameter. Both should be of type double. And I mentioned towards the bottom of this section in the hints area to use doubles for your data types. That's the best way to calculate here. But I also want to show you or get you to do some validation. So in other words, we want to confirm that the data we're working with is valid. So you need to first check that the first parameter feet is greater than and equal to 0. So long as the number is 0 or higher, we're going to say that that's a valid number that we can work with. So in other words, we're not going to accept numbers that are less than 0. And for inches, the second parameter, we want to make sure that it's greater than or equal to 0, and that it's also less than and equal to 12, which is the valid range of inches when you're looking at feet and inches together. Now, if you find that either of those conditions fail, so in other words, if feet is less than 0 or inches is less than 0 and inches is greater than 12. So if it's outside that range, in other words, you want to return -1 for both those scenarios. But if the parameters are valid, so in other words, we've got a valid feet parameter and valid inches, and we've validated that it's within the range that we want to work with, at that point, I want you to calculate how many centimetres comprise the feet and inches passed to this method. So you need to take the feet and inches, convert them to centimetres, and actually return that value back to the method that's calling it, and also print it out on the screen. Now for the second method, where we're going to overload this first method, so it's going to be obviously the same name, but we're only going to use one parameter, and the parameter is going to be inches. So we need to validate it again, and in this case you only want to validate that it's greater than or equal to 0. Unlike the first method, in this one we want to actually accept an inches parameter that can be literally any number. So we can accept 50 inches or 100 inches, and you still need to then convert it to centimetres. So you need to figure out how to convert that back to feet and inches so that you can call our first method, which has got the feet and inches parameter. So you'll need to figure out how to do that. So that's the tricky part, is working out how to do that, but then also calling that first method that we've created. So actually making sure that you're calling the right method. So you're calling one overloaded method from another overloaded method, if that makes sense. And in terms of hints, as I mentioned, use double for your numbers, data types, for your number data types. That's a good idea here. 1 inch equals 2.54 centimetres. You'll need to know that in terms of calculation. And if you don't know, 1 foot is 12 inches, and you'll need to know that also when you're doing conversions to and from inches to feet, etc. Now I'm going to show a link on the screen shortly, and this will show, this is just a website that you can go to verify your numbers are working. And from there you can confirm that your code is working. And just secondly, recalling another overloaded method, as you saw earlier in this video, just really requires you to use the right number of parameters, and then Java will do the rest. So keep that in mind when you're determining how to call one overloaded method from another. Let's go and have a look at this website before I pause and let you go away and create or your version of the code. So there's the website on screen there now, and there'll be a link to that in the resources section. So we could type something like 6 for 6 feet, and that's 182.8800 centimetres. So you'll just type in either the number of feet or the number of feet inches, or just the inches, and this will tell you what the centimetres are, and from there you can confirm that your code is correct and working properly. Okay, so that's it. So pause the video now, go away and complete the challenge, and when you're done and you want to come back and see what I've done, come back and I'll show you my solution. Pause the video now. Okay, so I hope you had some success and managed to get it working. So let's now go through and try and solve this. So what we're going to do first, well, actually, before I do anything, I'm going to make a bit of space here. And what we're going to do, I'll just make sure that this is still on screen so we can read it if we need to. Let's create our first method. So it's going to be public static double, and it was calc feet and inches to centimetres. And remembering that I asked for 2 parameters, the first one was double feet, double inches, like so. And we've got the double to return because we're going to ultimately return the number of centimetres. So what we need to do is some validation. So we need to make sure that feet is greater than or equal to 0. And we need to make sure that inches is in the range of being 0 or greater, but less than or equal to 12. So we're going to use some if logic and also use the ampersand as well to chain together some and conditions to do all this checking on one line. So we're going to put if feet is less than 0, and actually what we'll do is we'll use an or instead. So if feet is less than 0, it means that's invalid, or we'll put if inches is less than 0 and inches is greater than 12. If all that is the case, I'm going to open a code block and type return -1. So that's our validation. So what we're doing is we're saying if feet is less than 0, and we determined up here if it's less than 0, it's invalid, so we don't want to do any more processing. Or, remembering the two pipe characters are or if the inches is less than 0, and the inches is greater than 12. So both of those have to succeed in that case. So inches has to be less than 0 and greater than 12. So if it's outside the range in both those scenarios, we're going to return -1. That means we're going to do no more processing. But if we continue on down here, We know that return -1, so if that's the case, it's not going to come down here and do any more processing for us. So at this point, we can get to line 44 knowing that we've got valid parameters. So let's now do some calculations. We're going to put double centimetres equals, so we need to start figuring this out. So let's convert the feet component to centimetres first. To do that, we're going to put feet times 12. So why 12? Well, 12 is the number of inches in a foot. So by multiplying by 12 and then multiplying by 2.54, which we determined up here on line 32 was the calculation to convert an inch to a centimetre, we've now converted the feet, total feet that was passed to this method to centimetres. Now that still leaves the second parameter, inches. We need to separately convert that and add that to our total. So to do that, we're going to type centimetres plus equals. So we're going to add to centimetres, add the value. So we're going to take the existing value that we've already calculated on line 44, and to that we're going to add inches times 2.54. So we've now got centimetres to be has been correctly calculated for both feet and inches. So from that point, we can then go print out a message. We can put, let's put feet plus inches equals centimetres, cm abbreviated for centimetres. And then lastly, we'll do a return centimetres. So let's go ahead and run that. Now we'll have a bit of a discussion about -1 as well, because I haven't actually mentioned why you'd be returning -1. So let's run this first. Well, actually, before we run it, what we need to do is call it something, because this is telling us, by the way, that, okay, you've defined a method, but you've never used it. So let's put an example up here. And let's put calc. And we'll say, let's start with the 6 feet 0 inches, because we did that before. And just as a refresher, we determined that it was 182.88. That should be the number that we're looking for. We'll run that. 6 feet 0 inches equals 182.88 centimetres. So that's good. We've got the calculations correct. And let's just try one more. Let's try, say, 7 foot and 5 inches. We'll run that. 226.06 centimetres. And we'll go back to our website and we'll make this 7 foot 5 inches. 226.06. 226.06. So clearly that's working. The other thing we can try and do here is let's try and make that a -1 and a 1. We should get an error there. If we run that, it's just a bit confusing. I won't make it -1. Let's make it, say, -10. Run that. Now notice we haven't got a message at all. So in other words, what's happened is this code here has been fulfilled. So what we might do is we'll put a message here to say invalid feet or inches parameters. Let's do that just so we know that if it's errored and tried to return, we know that the parameters are invalid. Invalid feet or inches parameter, so that's good. And just to make a test there, we should be able to put up here, we will actually pass a parameter of 0 just to make sure that that does actually work. 0 feet 1 inches equals 2.54 centimetres. That's good, so it's still accepted 0, which we wanted it to do. So likewise for inches now, let's try, we'll go back to say 6 foot again, but let's try -10 for inches, which should give us an error. And we've got an error there, so why have we got the error there? So we should have actually had a test here to check whether our inches is out of range, and for some reason that's still working. So let's just come down and have a look at the code. So we've got if feet is less than 0 or inches is less than 0, and that and is actually wrong. So that and should actually be an or. So we've got two parts here. This is where it does get a bit confusing, which you need to look at the brackets. So I've got an and, but of course inches can't be less than 0 and greater than 12. It can only be one or the other. So therefore we want to test to see whether inches is less than 0 or it's greater than 12. So let's try running that again. Invalid feet or inches parameter, which is correct now. And let's try and put the value 13 in there. Run that. Invalid, which is good, but let's now put a valid range in there. 6 foot 0 again. 6 feet is 0 inches. It's still giving us the correct value. So our validation was slightly wrong there, and this is why testing can be a good idea sometimes, just to make sure you've got your values correct. Now the reason I'm returning -1 here, this is a good way to test for validation to check whether your calculations are correct. And what you could do here is ultimately you could have something like int centimetres sorry, it's not an int, it's a double. And I'll put if centimeters is less than 0.0 because it's a double. I'm going to print out a message here to say invalid parameters. Let's just run that. That hasn't come up, and that's because the data we got returned was centimeters, which was greater than 0. So that's correct. But if we change this to an invalid number again, 13, invalid parameters, as you can see there. So that's just a way of checking your parameters, and -1 is something that's commonly returned if there is a fault, if there is actually a problem with your code, and you could test for that like I've done here, if it's less than 0.0, or I could have done an equals test to see whether it equals 1 to print out an error message. So that's why I've used -1. Okay, this video is getting quite long, so let's see if we can finish off this second method and then end it. So what I'm going to do for that next method is I'm going to copy just the first line. And it can be a good idea to do this, to copy just the first line to make sure that you haven't made a typo, because obviously overloading a method relies on you typing the method name correctly. So if you're not typing it correctly, you're going to get what is a new method instead of overloading a method. So at the moment that's complaining because we've got another method of the same number of parameters. Let's change this now so it's just got inches, because if you recall, the second method only accepts inches. And a validation is that it's greater than or equal to 0. So this is much easier. So our validation should just be if inches is less than 0, return -1. So that's our only options here, is to check whether it's less than, if it's less than 0, then it's an error. So now what we need to do is we've got an inches parameter, but we need to call the overloaded method on line 43, and that needs us to pass the feet and the inches. So we need to convert the inches to feet and inches, if you know what I mean. So we need to extract firstly the number of feet that are in our inches, and then whatever the remainder is going to be the number of inches that forms part of the second parameter. So to do that, I'm going to type double feet equals, and I'm going to use int here, and that makes sure that it's converted to a whole number, inches divided by 12. So whereas we used multiplied by 12 on line 50, in this case we're dividing it by the inches by 12 to get the number of feet, and then that's the first parameter we're going to use, and the second one is going to be inches, so we're going to call that remaining inches, and we're going to use the remainder operator for that. So the way we can go about doing that is we can just put int, again we want a whole number, it's going to be inches remainder 12. So basically, again, as you saw in a previous video, using the remainder operator, it takes whatever you've typed as a number, divides that total number by that, and gives us the remainder. So in this case, what we're doing is we're basically dividing the inches parameter by 12, and whatever's left over from that is going to be put into our remaining inches. And we're doing that obviously to get just the remaining inches after the feet has been calculated. Once we've done that, we can actually output it. So let's do some output, and it's going to be, we'll type inches. Inches is equal to, we'll put feet and our remaining inches. And lastly, I can type return calc feet and inches to centimeters. So we're going to call the first one, and we're going to pass the two parameters, which are feet and inches. So you can see that I've killed two birds with the one stone there, so to speak, by returning and calling the method at the same time. So the return is going to get whatever the calculation is from calling that method up here. So we're actually passing the feet and inches to it so we can calculate, and it's going to return that value ultimately to up here where we're going to call it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to type calculate feet and inches, and we're going to pass 100 as our inches. And note that there's two options there because it's an overloaded method. We're going to go with the first one, which is passing 100. So let's run that and see that it works. And you can see what I've done here. So what I've actually done is I've passed the wrong parameter, haven't I? So you're wondering, why is this coming up saying invalid feet or inches parameters? What I've done is I've passed the second parameter as inches. Well, inches was 100. We called this second method, the second overloaded method, with a parameter of 100, and I've accidentally typed that in here as the parameter to call this first method. So what that should have been, of course, was remaining inches. Let's go ahead and try running that again. And now we've correctly got 8 feet 4 inches is 254 centimetres. So let's check that, 8 feet 4. So 8 feet 4, 254 centimetres. So that's correct. And just for kicks, let's do one more. Let's make this say 156. Run it again. 13 feet 0 inches is 300. That's a bit funny that I got that exact. Let's try and make it 157. I just want to see that it's working correctly. And we'll run that. There we go. 13 feet 1 inches. Let's try that. 13 feet 1 inch is 398.78 centimetres. 398.78, it's got 0.00003, but we're only looking at the first couple of decimal points up to there, and you can see that's clearly correct. So that's our code working, and the last thing to check would be our validation. We're going to put a -10 there, just to make sure that it works. If it doesn't work, if it's invalid, and we get no data back whatsoever, and that's because we've got this code in here saying if inches is less than 0, return -1. And we haven't got anything outputting here on line 15, which is why we haven't got a message. So I'll put that back to what it was and run it one last time. So that's it. That's my solution. Hopefully you enjoyed that and got a lot out of it. So method overloading is something that you will see a lot of in Java code. It's very commonly used. And although this particular example is a bit contrived, because it's probably going to be rare that you'd ever need to know that 100 inches converted to decimal is actually 157, which we established. Very rare that you'd need to know that 157 inches is equal to 13 feet and 1 inch, but this was just an example more of showing you how to use method overloading. In practice, when you're out there producing real sort of production Java code, you'll find overloaded methods are indeed very common. So that's it. I hope you've enjoyed that and got a lot out of it, and I'll see you in the next video.